So today we have Douglas Husak, and Professor Husak has a very long and distinguished publishing record. He got, the same year, I don't know what went on there, he must have written a very quick dissertation, but the same year, in 1976, he received both his JD and his PhD from Ohio State University. And since graduating, he has published dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, many of them in very distinguished places, major law journals. He has articles in Philosophy and Public Affairs, which is generally considered the leading journal in political philosophy and ethics in the country. And he has a number of books. He works, I always am hesitant to characterize someone because I've had people correct me about the areas in which they work, but I think he's known best for his work on criminal law and on punishment, though he's published in many areas, including areas that I would call pure ethical theory, sort of more pure and less applied philosophy of law. But I'll read you the names of several of his last books. Drugs and Rights, published by Cambridge in 1992. Legalize This, The Case for Decriminalizing Drugs, published by Verso in 2002. The Legalization of Drugs, co-authored with Peter de Menarf, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that name correctly, by Cambridge in 2005. Overcriminalization, The Limits of the Criminal Law, published by Oxford in 2008, and The Philosophy of Criminal Law, Selected Essays, published by Oxford in 2010. I think if you teach or work in philosophy of law, you're inevitably going to come across some of his essays, and it's pretty fair to say that he is definitely one of the leading philosophers of law in the English-speaking world today. So we're very happy to have him here, and he's going to present his paper. Afterwards, we will have a question and answer period, and then we will have a reception right outside. We're hoping it won't be too chilly, but you're all welcome to come to that. So let's welcome Professor Husak.
Well, thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is a pretty good sized audience. I rarely have an audience this large, except when I teach a big 100 introductory class. And in that class, people are texting and sleeping, and I hope not to see too much of that today. I'll try my best to keep you awake, and I will do it without using PowerPoint or any other kind of props. And I know that that's all the trend these days, and maybe I'm a Luddite, but it's not as though I have charts and graphs and things that you need power visuals for. And so some of my colleagues have really nice PowerPoints, but it seems to me that they're more amusing than they are really enlightening, and they'll show you busts of Plato, or they'll show you really, cute cartoon things. I won't do that, and I hope to be able to keep you awake with a topic that I like to think is of wide interest, and that's drugs. And when I asked what I might talk about, I was told, well, drugs are always something that people are interested in on any number of levels. And so I'm delighted to be able to talk about drugs. And I'm really interested in what an audience thinks. I think it's a topic in which you hear some remarkable things said by people like you. So I look forward to that. I've spent about a quarter of my life thinking about, reading about, talking about, writing about drugs. And there's so much to learn if you think about it at all. Every discipline has something to say about drugs, and so economists and historians and psychologists and pharmacologists and political scientists and criminologists, on and on and on. Every discipline has something to say about drugs, and there is not a single person in the world who has a handle on it all. And I like to think I'm the philosopher by default, really, who has done the most work about drugs. And when I was introduced, it sounded as though I'd written 3 books about drugs, and I guess that's literally true. But frankly, I wrote the same book 3 times and changed the title and updated a bit of the statistics and so forth. There's so much to know empirically, but in terms of the moral issues involving drugs, I've spent a very long time where I didn't change my mind about much of anything and thought there was nothing much new to learn. And I've recently learned something that's new, and that's kind of exciting, and so that's part of what I want to share with you. Also, really, the focus of the talk is what I don't understand, and not for want of trying, but there's a lot about drugs that's still very mysterious to me and that I don't understand, and so only a philosopher can give a lecture about what he doesn't understand, I guess. So I want to talk about some of the things that I think are rather mysterious. Here's one mysterious thing, which is that as I said, philosophers don't talk about this issue, which is rather remarkable. And if you think about, and some of you are philosophers, and you think about the greatest philosophers who are political philosophers and legal philosophers in my lifetime, and the three names I would throw out, you're welcome to add or subtract from the list, but I think Rawls, Dworkin, Raz, probably the three greatest philosophers of law and political philosophers in my lifetime, and not one of those three very distinguished, philosophers said a word about drugs, not one word. And that strikes me as kind of remarkable because it's such an important issue affecting so many people. Why do philosophers not have much to say here? Probably because the topic is so incredibly fact-sensitive. If you're going to say much about drugs, you better know a lot of facts, and philosophers, are notoriously allergic to facts, moral issues that aren't especially fact-sensitive, and so there is that explanation for why philosophers have little to say here. What else is mysterious? Well, drug trends are mysterious to me. The latest household survey, the most authoritative survey indicating trends in drug use in high schools, says that the use of every drug that's tracked is down among high school seniors, with an exception of marijuana, which has ticked up a little bit, certainly the least dangerous drug. And the use of cocaine and heroin in schools has hit an all-time low, all-time since they've been tracking since 1995. So it's rather interesting why trends are as they are. I don't think anyone has a good sense of why trends are as they are, why the use of these drugs is down. And if you think, well, that's an indication that our punitive policy is working, of course, the use of alcohol is even down quite a bit, and tobacco as well. Every drug is down except marijuana, and I wonder why that's so. Maybe there's a new health consciousness in schools. It's really hard to say. Possibly the best explanation is the substitution of diverted pharmaceuticals and other substances for the drugs that have long been surveyed. So I have students who I like to hope they can confide in me. I have a student the other day who said he was actually buying ayahuasca over the web using Bitcoin. I mean, I was astounded that anyone would be doing this. He also confided in me that he lost his shirt, and I wasn't so surprised at that. If you're buying a Schedule I narcotic using an imaginary currency from someone you don't know to an address that's fictitious, it's not surprising that you would lose a lot of money, and that's what happened to him. But I actually think what's fascinating is that for the first time in quite a while, there does seem to be a real gap between generational divide in the drugs that are being used among high school seniors and on college campuses and the drugs that were used 10, 20 years ago. So the generational divide really closed, and now it's opening up again between the drugs that guys my age do, if any, and the drugs that are being used by people much, much younger. Well, lots and lots that's mysterious, to me at any rate, about drugs. What I want to focus on is the issue of why we're still where we are and why the basic approach we've been taking a very long time, which is obviously a very punitive approach, why that persists and why we continue to rely on a criminal justice solution to the problems that are caused by drugs. And maybe you can help me understand this because, frankly, I don't. I want to set the problem up a little bit and then tell you what is my biggest insight, at least, about this issue in a very long time. And that will come at the end of the talk, and maybe that'll keep you in suspense and keep you awake if you have to wait until the punchline at the very end. So sure, there has been a bit of progress, and some people think change is real rapid now, and it's certainly more rapid than it's been in a while. We now have 20 states with medical marijuana, 2 states with outright marijuana legalization. between 52 and 58% of the public, depending on the survey, thinks that legalization of marijuana is a good idea. And that's quite a sea change in a very small period of time. It looks like the rapid change we've seen in approval ratings about gay marriage, which 10 years ago people thought it was 30 years away, and now here it is in many places. So things can change pretty quickly, and public opinion about marijuana has changed pretty quickly, and that's noteworthy. But progress, or what I take to be progress, outside of marijuana has been pretty slow, I think. Sure, there's progress even here. The notorious crack cocaine sentencing disparity has ended or been eroded at any rate. And most significantly of all, although this is not something that gets a whole lot of publicity, is that the U.S. Sentencing Commission has just recently, like last week, recommended a substantial across-the-board reduction in punishments for virtually all drug offenses. And that's a pretty big deal, though it doesn't seem to have gotten the publicity that some of these other things get. But so there's change, there's progress, or what I call progress, and maybe you agree with me. I'll say why I think of this as progress, but there's change, and yet it's very slow, and in some places non-existent with respect to many drugs. And I also wouldn't assume that further reform is inevitable. Maybe we're on a pendulum rather than a plane. It's not as though, well, just extrapolate and 3 years from now we'll be a little farther than we were 3 years ago. I mean, it's hard to know. Things could still go wrong, and so it's hard to know really where we're headed. What I want to focus on is why the pace of change has been so slow, and there are several reasons, I think, but why it's perplexing. If you really look at the predictions that were made 35 years ago, you found that people said that when the drug-using population in 1980, 1979, when illicit drug use hit an all-time high, when that population aged and became old enough to have real political power, talking about people roughly my age, when people my age came to have political power, they would change the things that had been in place by their parents who didn't know one drug from another. And that actually, of course, hasn't happened. And one wonders why that's so, why those predictions all none of them came true. One thing that happened, of course, is that we became parents, and then the things that we didn't want to see our kids do. That's one explanation, but I'm really not exactly sure what happened to make change so slow. So we might have expected it to come sooner, and here are some reasons why I'm a little perplexed. So I think it's hard to find a sophisticated, knowledgeable, normatively sophisticated at any rate, spokesperson who supports anything like the status quo in our drug policy today. So I counted 30-some drug panels I've been on, and often I'm asked to recommend who should be on the panel and who should be on the other side. And of course you want to find someone who's good. I mean, it's no fun and it's no challenge debating idiots. You want people who really are sophisticated and knowledgeable. And frankly, it's hard to find people on the other side who know much and who can defend anything like the status quo. You can find people who work in emergency rooms, or you can find policemen who have lots and lots of scary anecdotes. You can find people whose families have been devastated by illicit drugs. No shortage of people who have real scary anecdotes, and of course they invite you to generalize from worst case scenarios. But finding people who really are immersed in the drug literature and know some data is not easy. So I don't know who is the spokesperson for the status quo, who I think we should all pay attention to. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but here's the person you should read if you want the point of view different from my own. But I don't really know who or what to recommend for that. And so that's one of the things that makes me wonder why change hasn't come faster. In addition, of course, money's very tight. And now there's widespread agreement across the whole political spectrum that the war on drugs hasn't really been worth its cost. This is something that both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal agree about. And they don't agree on too many things, but they agree about this. And you can find countless authors who discover anew what other people have known for a very long time, which is that our regime of drug prohibitions is ineffective and counterproductive. You've all heard this, I think, so I won't belabor this. prohibitions are thought to be ineffective because of their negligible impact on both supply and on demand. They're counterproductive for any number of reasons. Presumably everyone has heard how they disproportionately affect minorities and how they fund organized crime, especially south of our borders, right, where the real drug war has been waged for some time. We hear less often how it may be the case that prohibition actually increases drug use among adolescents, in particular by creating forbidden fruit effects. I mean, everyone knows that there are forbidden fruit effects generally, especially among adolescents, and about drugs in particular. No one has ever measured that to my knowledge, and I would love to find out if that could be quantified. And I think that's a real interesting phenomenon. When you go to these marijuana dispensaries now that are legal or for medical purposes, and the adolescents who are 21-year-olds who think they're cool are standing in line next to guys my age, then it's hard to see that the allure of drugs can continue. We'll see. I think it'll be real interesting how the demand for drugs among the current drug-using age cohort changes when they no longer think of what they're doing as quite as cool as they thought because they're standing in line next to people like me. So it's also the case, of course, you can go on and on about how drug prohibitions are counterproductive, and there's all kinds of things to say. The most important thing to say, of course, is how they devastate the lives of the poor people who happen to get caught and arrested and prosecuted and convicted. And of course, in today's tough economy, a conviction for a drug crime is a terrible thing to have. And so the worst thing that can happen to most people in the context of the drug war is that they actually get caught and prosecuted and have a record. Well, what you don't, so you hear all that, and that's not new. What you don't hear quite as often is how drug prohibitions are indefensible in principle, and you don't hear that because people who work on principles, like philosophers, as I've said, don't talk about drugs very much. But I work at the intersection of criminal law and moral philosophy, so it seems to me that even if you could make drug prohibitions effective and make them productive, not counterproductive, make them do more good than harm, they still would be unjustifiable, even in principle. And I just want to summarize my case for thinking that, just so I don't make claims, a few reasons to think that. So if I'm right about that, though, and if I'm right about what I will say, then the continued persistence of our drug policy really is something of a mystery. And it's especially true at the federal level, I think, more so than at the state level, where most of the progress has been made. Just about all the progress really is at the state level. And you really have a hard time thinking who leads the federal reform movement. You know, apart from libertarians, maybe Rand Paul, there's no real impetus for a relaxation of federal drug prohibition. And, you know, care less about drugs than they care about shrinking the size of government. So there is very little movement at the federal level. I'm not sure why. People tell me why, but none of the explanations I hear really persuade me. So maybe some of the slow pace is explained by conceptual confusions. So if philosophers are good at anything, well, then they're good at clarifying concepts. And so consider the uncertainty about terms like decriminalization and legalization. If you're a little mixed up about that, but too embarrassed to ask, join the club. People who specialize in criminal law and criminal law theory don't use those terms in a consistent way. So there's nothing to be embarrassed about if you're confused about what these terms mean. Maybe legalization is a term that should be avoided altogether. But what I mean by decriminalization, and what I invite you to mean by it, is simple, and it's deceptively simple. And what's deceptive about the simplicity is what I want to elaborate on. But what's simple about it is just means this, that the use and possession of a given drug shouldn't be a crime, shouldn't be a criminal offense. That's what you mean by a proposal to decriminalize. It's not a criminal offense anymore. So by definition, I think, criminal laws are those laws that subject people to punishment. So anyone who thinks that a given drug should be decriminalized thinks that no one should be punished simply for using that drug. And there's some enormous confusion on that topic. If you look at polls, people say things like they don't want to punish people for using drugs, but they don't want to see that drug decriminalized. They say things like that. And of course, if I'm right about what decriminalization means, then that's just incoherent. You can't think that. You're confused on the level of concepts. So that shouldn't be so hard. I want to mention 5 reasons why I think it's deceptively simple to mean what I said decriminalization means. So here's one reason, and that is that punishment for drug use really isn't the norm. If you look at statutes, what they typically prohibit is not use but possession. And so literally it's false to say that there really are many punishments for using drugs. What you're punished for is drug possession typically, and so use is not criminalized. Although it is some places, but not very many. And yet I don't take that to be a deep significant point. It seems to me that what the statutes that govern drugs punish and what they target is possession rather than use, simply because it's easier to prove. And so I don't attach much significance to this. So I'm going to continue to speak as though it's use that's criminalized, and except in unusual cases, philosophers love unusual cases, but except in unusual cases, it's pretty hard to use a drug without possessing it. So second reason why this idea sounds simple, but it's not as simple as it seems, is that we shouldn't try to simply decide whether or not a drug should be prohibited or not without paying attention to the purpose for which the drug is used, right? People talk about drugs being illegal, drugs being prohibited, but to be a little more clear, you've got to specify the purpose for which the drug is used before you can talk about whether that use is criminalized or not. So the topic really isn't about drug use per se, but it's really about a specific kind of drug use that is a particular reason for using drugs. So you might well decide that one and the same drug, cocaine, morphine, Prozac, you might decide that that drug should be criminalized for some purposes and decriminalized for other purposes. Of course, that's exactly what the law has decided. So presumably, the use of these drugs should not be a criminal offense when the user has a medical reason to use them. But attitudes and reactions and state policy, of course, are entirely different when that same drug is used for a non-medical purpose. And of course, drugs can be used for all kinds of non-medical purposes. There are any number, but the one that I want to emphasize is what, for lack of a better term, I just call recreational use. And pretty hard to actually be very precise about what that means. But when people use a drug in order to seek pleasure, euphoria, satisfaction, or some other positive psychological state, that's what I mean by recreational use. So they're interested in using drugs to attain some kind of phenomenological state, a drug high, okay? That's what we'll mean by recreational use. And so if a person uses any of the drugs I just mentioned, cocaine, morphine, Prozac, if you're using those drugs recreationally, well, obviously you're looking at some pretty severe punishments if you're caught and arrested and prosecuted. The sentences are pretty severe, but nothing at all is done to you if you're using those drugs for a medical purpose. So you need some way to decide when the use of a drug is medical, that's fine, and when it's used recreationally, that's bad, says the law. And so we need to be able to draw the line between medical and non-medical use. And that's really, really hard. And it's a philosophical question. So here's where philosophers maybe have something to say, trying to decide when something is used medically and when it's used non-medically requires that we know what the province of medicine is. So I suppose what makes a use medical is that you're using a drug to combat a disease, illness, syndrome, something like that, disorder. And so you need a theory. You can go back to Plato about what kinds of conditions are diseases or illness or syndromes or disorders. Surprisingly, a hard thing to specify. And of course, there are some people who are surprisingly hard to refute who go around saying things like all drug use is medical. And it's very hard to say why they're wrong about that. Okay, so here is a third point about why the account of decriminalization is deceptively simple. What's deceptive about it? And so it depends, of course, on what we mean by punishment. Because if you've decriminalized a drug, what you mean is that people who use that drug don't or shouldn't get punished. And of course, we need to know what a punishment is in order to know whether people who are treated in a given way are being punished, so that the state that authorizes users to be treated in that way, has the state decriminalize the drug or not. We need to know what punishments are. So a lot of people go around saying things like, well, what we shouldn't do with drug users is put them in prison. What we should do is give them fines, tickets, like parking tickets. And they call that decriminalization. And others say that what we should do to drug users is make them undergo treatment. And they call that decriminalization. And so whether those ideas are or are not consistent with decriminalization depends on whether or not fines and coerced treatments are modes of punishment, or whether instead they are alternatives to punishment. So again, these are conceptual philosophical issues. I've got views on them. I mean, I tend to think that both fines and coerced treatment are modes of punishment, even though those modes of punishment almost certainly are better, preferable to what we now do to drug users. Those responses are really ruled out by decriminalization as I construe it. But that's a really fairly minor quibble. It's not a minor quibble, but it's not something I want to pay a lot of attention to today. The point is, whatever you take punishment to be, or whatever punishment is, that's what decriminalization prevents the state from doing to drug users. And so you can have different ideas about what kinds of things are punishments. We talked about this a bit at lunch today, and there's controversy about what kinds of responses the state might take to you are or are not punishments. And so if you're confused about that, then if those kinds of responses are allowed by the state, you're going to be confused as to whether the state has or has not decriminalized the drug, the use of which allows the state to treat you in that way. Okay. Here's another thing deceptively simple about this account, which is that it has nothing at all to say about what should be done to people who produce or sell drugs. So decriminalization just says users don't get punished. And it has nothing at all to say, as I understand it, about producers, distributors, manufacturers. So it's not really a comprehensive drug policy that can rival the status quo. The considerations that I think count in favor of decriminalizing use are quite different from the considerations that count in favor of decriminalizing production and sale. So I put production and sale aside, at least temporarily. The first thing to do is to decide what should be done to drug users. And once you're clear about that, then you can move on to production and sale. But I think you should start with questions about use. And I get a lot of criticism for this. People think that you need to take all these questions together often. And I'm more convinced than ever. For a while I thought, well, maybe they're right. Now I'm actually more convinced than ever that I was right all along. It's nice to have that feeling. And so I want to distinguish between use and production and sale. Many thoughtful people disagree with me. But at any rate, if you mean by decriminalization what I mean, then no implications at all for use and distribution and sale. Got views about those things, but that's down the road. That's one more thing about the oddity or deceptive simplicity of my account of decriminalization. If you think about what was called prohibition in the context of our alcohol policy from 1920 to 1933, you may know in that notorious era that almost everyone thinks was a disaster, you found that production and sale were banned, right? But use or possession was not banned. It was just production and sale. And that's what they call prohibition. Well, what they call prohibition, or what is always called prohibition in the context of alcohol policy, is really exactly what I mean by decriminalization. And that shows you the oddity of using these terms. And so there's something very peculiar about thinking that what prohibition is for alcohol policy is what decriminalization is for illicit drug policy, but I think that's the way these terms are actually used. No wonder people get confused. Okay, so with those preliminaries out of the way, we know what decriminalization means, and then we want to know, well, why should we believe it or should we believe it? And so I think the basic question to ask is not whether we should decriminalize a given drug. Pick your drug, heroin, cocaine, whatever, pick your drug. And the question that's most basic isn't whether we should decriminalize it, but the question is whether it should be criminalized. That's the question to ask. And if that's the right question to ask, more on that in a minute, then I think the answer is that we should decriminalize drugs because nobody's ever given a good reason in favor of criminalization. And so no reason to criminalize that anyone's ever given is any good. And so in the absence of a reason to criminalize, then the default position is decriminalization. That's the way I tend to think about illicit drugs. And I want to make a few points about that general strategy for arguing for decriminalization. First, why is that the right question to ask? Well, again, I run together questions about criminalization and punishment. So if criminal laws are laws that subject people to punishment, then we know, I have known this ever since Plato, that punishment requires a moral justification. So the fundamental question is, what justifies punishing drug users? That's the question that needs to be asked. And whenever I'm on panels about decriminalization, they always ask me to go first. Give your arguments in favor of decriminalization. And I always think that that's not the right approach. The burden of proof really should be on the punisher, right? What are we trying to do when we punish drug users? You shouldn't privilege the status quo, especially in the context of punishment. The status quo has to be defended when you're punishing. And so I think that, again, the best reason not to punish is simply that no reason to punish is very good. Rationalization or any kind of argument for decriminalization is going to rebut some argument for criminalization. And without an argument for criminalization on the table, there's nothing to rebut. And so it's hard to know how to proceed unless you're rebutting something that no one has ever explained. So you're in the position of Hume. I want to quote a philosopher and show that I'm a real philosopher, so I'm going to quote my favorite philosopher, Hume, and here is a statement he made, quote, "'Tis impossible to refute a system which has never been explained. In such a manner of fighting in the dark, a man loses his blows in the air and often places them where the enemy is not present," unquote. Well, I think it's exactly the predicament people are in when they argue for decriminalization. They are trying to rebut something, a case that's never been made. So I always think on a panel about decriminalization, the people who advocate decriminalization should go last, and let's hear what can be said in favor of what we're doing, and that's where I think people will not be able to deliver a satisfactory answer. So, what else about this way of thinking about decriminalization? Well, I think it's not very exciting. It doesn't invoke any real deep principle like, one man, one vote, or, freedom of speech or something. There's no real slogan that you can, and so it's less exciting than it would be if you had some nice slogan that you could go around spouting. And so I don't have any simple slogan that makes all this as exciting as I'd like it to be. I don't think any real deep principles are being violated here by drug prohibitions, unless it's the principle, which I guess is pretty deep, that you shouldn't be punished without a good reason. No one thinks that you should be punished in the absence of a good reason. So that's maybe a kind of a deep principle, but it's not very catchy, it seems to me. And so not much excitement here. But every now and then I think that drug prohibitions really do implicate deep principles, and there is something going on that is really important and fundamental. And so let me illustrate that with respect to some statutes. So criminal lawyers love statutes. Criminal law is statutory. And remember that drugs are prohibited for a given purpose. They're not just plain prohibited. They're usually prohibited for a given purpose. Most drugs, not all, but most are prohibited for a purpose. Let me read to you the text of the California statute that prohibits nitrous oxide, okay? And so this is one of my favorite statutes, and I'm going to leave out the ... part, but this is a verbatim quote. Otherwise, the statute makes it, quote, "a crime for any person to possess nitrous oxide with the intent to breathe or inhale for purposes of causing a condition of intoxication, elation, euphoria, dizziness, stupefaction, or dulling of the senses, or for the purpose of, in any manner, changing mental processes." Okay, so let me parse that. The idea is that you're prohibited from possessing something with the intent to use it for a certain purpose, and that purpose is, among other things, to become dizzy or elated for the purpose of changing mental processes. So that's the crime, possessing something for those purposes. And so it's hard to see how, if you really understand what that statute is saying, it's hard to see how a law like that is consistent with a system of laws in which we believe in something like freedom of speech and freedom of thought, which is even more basic than freedom of speech. You're not allowed to change your mental processes. That's what the statute tells you you can't do. And that's a peculiar thing to think is legitimate in a state that is committed, presumably, to freedom of thought. So maybe there is some deep principle implicated in drug prohibitions after all, and that statute might illustrate what it is. I'm actually tempted to think there's something to this. I don't tend to make too big a deal out of this. If you think there are these deep principles that are at stake, then I would be happy, of course, to hear about them, and it would be something that would actually make my own case stronger, so maybe you can assist me. So, also this defense that I've just given you is pretty inconclusive, right? If in fact the best reason to decriminalize is that there's no reason to criminalize, then you had better go through and look at all the reasons to criminalize and show that they're all bad, and you can never be sure you've got them all. In fact, at the end, I want to get to some reasons that I hadn't never really considered until very recently, but you can never be sure you've got and rebutted all the reasons that people give. So I just want to go through, really quickly, and again, I apologize if this is all very familiar to you, but if you look at the arguments people do give, and if you are a veteran of going around talking about drugs, people in the audience will eventually make one of these points. At some point, people will start talking about adolescence. It's impossible to actually talk about drug decriminalization without someone mentioning the need to protect the youth of today, and exactly how punishing adults for doing something is supposed to protect youth is never entirely clear, but people right away start talking about children. And so somehow they play a fundamental role in thought about drug decriminalization. And secondly, health, right? Anytime you recommend that, hey, we should legalize or not punish people for using marijuana, somebody is bound to raise his hand and say, well, hasn't there been a study showing that marijuana kills brain cells or not good for your memory or something like that? And the implied premises here that are never articulated would be fascinating to identify. The idea, I guess, is that you should be punished in order to prevent you from doing something that would be bad for your health, which is a pretty remarkable proposition. And of course, if you took that and extended it, you'd be punished for a whole lot of things that people do. A lot of people have terrible habits when it comes to diet and exercise. The idea you're punished because you might do something that would be bad for your health is pretty fantastic, but people right away start talking about health in the context of drugs. People also start talking about morality, and drug use is just alleged to be wrong. People have these visceral reactions, more so 10, 20 years ago than today, but people still have these visceral moral feelings about drug use. But what's exactly supposed to be wrongful about using drugs is rarely ever articulated. It's some kind of brute intuition a lot of people have that's rarely defended. The fourth argument that's often trotted out has to do with a connection between drugs and crime. And by crime, I don't mean drug crime. I mean, of course, drugs are connected with drug crime. I mean real crime, crime that we're all concerned about, rape, murder, and all kinds of violence. And if drugs actually had a kind of causal role in crime, well, it seems to me you'd have an in principle pretty good reason to look very carefully at whether we should decriminalize that drug. This strikes me as the best reason, frankly, of all the reasons I've very quickly summarized. And so you need to look very carefully at the drugs-crime connection. A lot of people have done that. And it's a specialty in criminology, the drugs-crime connection, and philosophers should poach on that turf with a lot of caution. One thing I think it's really interesting is to look at what's happening in New York City, where I live just outside of New York City. And as you may know, New York City has experienced in the last 15 years a Guinness World Book of Record crime drop, and it's not imaginary. There's always doubt about criminology statistics, but the crime drop in New York City is unbelievable. No criminologist predicted crime rates in New York City to be anything like what they are now. And so the question, of course, is why? If I had $1 for every conference I've attended where people try to figure out what caused crime to drop as much as it has, you've got 15 different people with 12 different answers. And so a lot of people would love to take credit, and some of them obviously deserve credit, but it's not clear exactly who or why. But there has been a tremendous crime drop. And so here's one thing that we do know, we think we know, which is that the crime drop was accompanied without a real reduction in the amount of drug use. And so by any account of drug use, and I'm talking about the drugs that are implicated in crime, right? People think cocaine, heroin, the opiates may be implicated in crime, methamphetamine. No one thinks marijuana is implicated in crime, except maybe as a crime that was thought to be caused by the use of those drugs. So the drug-crime connection has really come under a lot of empirical scrutiny lately, and there were people who said you can't win the war on crime without winning the war on drugs. And that was the slogan you found some criminologists espousing. And it looks like we have almost won the war on crime without winning the war on drugs. So that's kind of interesting that it's possible to do. Again, so what did change? Well, one of the things that changed is the wiping out of open-air drug markets. And so these places where you could go to buy drugs are now very much changed. And some have vanished altogether. Walk through Washington Square Park 20 years ago, walk through it today, you wouldn't recognize it. It's like Times Square. It's hard to believe it's the same place in terms of what's going on there and how deviant people are. So what's changed? Well, mobile phones really have revolutionized drug markets, and they've done that without decreasing crime. Okay, so my point, my argument against criminalization depends on the claim that no case for criminalization has ever been defended. And it's astounding. Again, not just can I not recommend people on a panel to defend criminalization, I can't recommend a book either. And so people say in their current moral and social issue anthologies that students sometimes read, you read somebody against punishing drug users. Sometimes it's me you read. And then who's on the other side? And frankly, it's hard to find good people on the other side. So it's not as though there's any spokesperson out there, and that is, I think, noteworthy. So this rationale for decriminalization makes minimal assumptions about justice, which is good. Justice is controversial. Who knows what justice is? But the idea that we shouldn't punish people without good reason sounds like a pretty good principle of justice that most of us can defend, although, of course, we can disagree about what counts as a good reason. Well, let me give you my conclusions. And, of course, we can always be wrong about this, but here they are. And there's no single argument that's going to rebut every single argument that's ever been given to criminalize any given drug. You've got to proceed argument by argument, drug by drug. And so that's, of course, a big challenge. Obviously, we might have very good reasons to criminalize some drugs and not others. No one has ever wanted to criminalize caffeine, presumably because of how caffeine affects people. And so I think it's easy to imagine, philosophers love imaginary cases, right? It's easy to imagine a drug that we should criminalize. I just don't think there actually are any such drugs, but you can imagine them. And my favorite example is the substance that changed Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde, right? And so I guess that was a drug. I have to admit, I've never read the book, so I don't really know. But I've seen the movie, and in the movie, the guy takes a drug and it turns him into a homicidal monster. And if there really were drugs like that did that, well, sure, yeah, we should punish people for using drugs like that. But there aren't, empirically, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. People always remind me that there's some new drug coming out of Russia or something that is like this, and maybe there is. So again, in print, it's not as though it's conceptually impossible to think of a drug that we'd want to criminalize. I just don't think there are any such things. But maybe I'm wrong. They're always there. At any rate, that's what I've come to believe. Notice also the enormous burden that any argument for criminalization would have to bear. There are maybe 115, 120 million living Americans who have used an illicit drug at some point in their lives. That's more than half the population over 12 years old. So maybe 15, 16, 17 million Americans use illicit drugs every year on literally billions of occasions, and very few of those occasions produce any harm. longitudinal studies that track people who've been using drugs for a very long time and make that population relative to people who haven't ever used drugs, lifetime abstainers, and then you look at how well they're doing, how much money they make, how many divorces they've had, how happy they report they are. See any significant differences between the population of drug users as a whole and the population of non-drug users. So if drugs are as scary as some people make them out to be, it doesn't really much show up in these longitudinal data. So you punish all these people for things that can happen in a very small subset of cases. And of course, things can go very wrong using drugs. We all know these horrible stories, and many of them are true. And I don't mean to be a Pollyanna about this, but to punish all these people in order to prevent something that happens in only a tiny percentage of cases strikes me as wildly over-inclusive, and that's something we should be very reluctant to do. And so when you can't punish all people for something, what do? You only punish some people, and who are the people you punish? Typically, they're the least powerful, and it's been pointed out that our prohibition would have vanished long ago if whites had been punished at the same rate as minorities. We all have heard this, but it's a scandal, and it's one of those features of drug prohibition that I think should outrage everyone. And so some people try to package drug prohibitions as a benefit to minorities, but I don't see that. There's plenty of evidence that they devastate minority communities and will continue to do so as long as prohibition is so selective, and it's got to be selective because you can't possibly punish everyone who is using illicit drugs. So, okay, no good spokesperson. You've got no sound economic rationale for punishment. You got no good philosophical rationale for punishment. You got lots else to say against drug prohibitions. So why do we still have them? Well, that's the puzzle that I have wrestled with. All that can be said against it, why does the edifice of drug prohibition show only a few cracks here and there? So here's the insight that I mentioned at the beginning that I recently had. Here's the new thing I've learned about drugs in the last year. So many of us assumed, and I was one of them, assumed all along that the point of drug prohibitions was to reduce the prevalence of drug use and the harms that drug use causes. And it does cause harms. So the point of drug prohibitions, I had thought, and most people think, is to reduce drugs. And that is something I no longer take for granted. So in the eyes of many of the big players in the criminal justice system, drug policy is not really about drugs. So that's what I have come to believe. This is not a universe. This is something I think is true of many people, or many players in the criminal justice system. And for many of them, drug policy is not really about drugs. So if I'm right about that, then it's easy to see why none of the arguments I just gave are going to persuade people, because they're all arguments about drugs, and that's not what these people are worried about. So I got to be careful here. The ideological support for drug prohibitions is, of course, very complex and varied. So you think about the political forces that unified to bring about alcohol prohibition in 1920, and you had a very odd coalition made up of religious fundamentalists, right? Feminists who didn't like their husbands in these saloons. You had medical practitioners who were worried about the effects of alcohol. You had anti-immigrant xenophobes who noticed that manufactured by Germans who happened to be the enemy in World War I. And you had a really odd coalition that brought alcohol prohibition into existence in 1919 and 1920. So the situation with drugs is similarly complex, I think, with many of those same parties playing a major role. Although I'm not really sure who is in that coalition, it would be great to find out. Unless you know who is opposing you, it's pretty hard to fight against them. And so the particular parties in the coalition that continues to implement our punitive drug policies is a little bit mysterious to me, but it's made up of a lot of diverse factions, and I don't want to try to speak for all of them. But here is the wrinkle. I think alcohol prohibitions, as far as I can tell, I'm not so old to have actually lived through that era, but I think they were mostly about alcohol, mostly about controlling alcohol and the harms that alcohol caused. But in the eyes of many people, drug prohibitions are not primarily about controlling drugs. So that's my insight, and I want to spend the rest of my time elaborating on it. So if drug prohibitions and our drug policy is not really about drugs, then what could it be about? Well, the alternative you probably heard, and people make a lot of mileage out of saying, this is the new Jim Crow, right? This is the way that we whites control racial minorities. And I've heard this allegation, and it contains, a grain of truth, but I tend to think it's mostly exaggerated. I'm not as persuaded by it as many of my friends and colleagues. Drug prohibitions are enacted and enforced really vigorously by many people who don't have a racist bone in their bodies. At least I want to suggest a different kind of explanation, one that certainly can explain in part the disproportionate racial impact, but is not really racist. And don't forget, by the way, that the prime beneficiaries of the crime drop in New York City and elsewhere, the main beneficiaries are the people who otherwise would have been victims of crime, and they, of course, are largely minority. So they've been a real beneficiary of a crime drop, and that fact makes the policy a good deal less racist than its critics allege. So let me explain what seems to me to be going on in the eyes of many people. And in order to do that, I'm going to go back to New York City, which I talked about a minute ago as having this unbelievable crime drop. So, as I've heard some of the major players in New York City tell the story, and who are these people? The chief of police, big deal. The district attorney. These people, when you press them, what are you guys, why are you doing this? I mean, these guys are smart. They're not dopes, right? They're not people who don't really know the difference between marijuana and sugar. They're really savvy, and you try to figure out, well, why are you doing what you're doing? And they don't really care that much about drugs. Now, so what do they care about? Well, some police departments use the drug war as a way of getting revenue. They do asset forfeiture, and they drive around fancy cars that drug dealers drove around. And there's some of that. Funds are not available, and resources are in decline. So there's some of that. But that's not the story I want to tell. I want to talk about the best police departments and what they're doing and why they're interested in drug prohibitions. So what they're interested in is not so much controlling drugs. They're much more interested in controlling crime. And by crime, again, I mean real crime. I don't mean drug crime. Again, that's obvious that drug crime is caused by drugs. I'm talking about rape, murder, and robbery, all kinds of things that we really ought to care about. So these people are much more worried about crime than they are about drugs. So I think that police and prosecutors often use drug prohibitions pretty much as a pretext to solve and prevent other crimes. So it's pretty amazing to listen to these people, and they tell stories about how hassling and detaining even petty drug users and threatening them with arrest and threatening them with very severe punishments has helped to solve and to prevent a whole lot of non-drug related crime. So here is, again, an explanation of why you get these incredibly draconian punishments for drug use. It really enables people to threaten very credibly that petty drug users with these very severe punishments, and so you can get a lot more cooperation from them. Drug offenders know a lot about what's going on in the streets. If you look at the profile of drug users and look at their age and ethnicity and so forth, they overlap quite a bit with people who are committing serious crimes in terms of their demographic profile. Many of these people really are criminals. Getting them and their fingerprints into the system is pretty effective. Or so police claim. They tell you all these stories about all the crimes they've solved and prevented by having a pretext to arrest and hassle and detain and question and threaten petty drug users. So that's what these police claim, and we philosophers should be pretty reluctant to go to police and tell them, well, no, this isn't an effective strategy. I mean, I take it they have better ideas than we philosophers have about what tactics are useful in solving crime. And don't forget, they have impressive results. I mean, they really have prevented a whole lot of crime. And this is the story they often tell as to how they did it. And so it's a story that's maybe as plausible as any, and you need a competing story before you should think that this is a story that has no credibility at all. So that's, I think, a lot of what's going on with drug prohibition. Not so much about drugs, it's about crime. And of course, this is supposed to be an explanation. This is my new insight into what's going on, because I couldn't figure out why our drug prohibition had still persisted. But now I think I have a better idea about why that's so in the eyes of people who I thought would know better. Now I think I have a better understanding of it. Of course, this is not a justification. I don't think this justifies much. It just explains what is otherwise inexplicable. I think these pretextual crimes, if that's what you want to call them, are unacceptable in principle, and drug laws continue to be wildly over-inclusive, and you punish a great many people in order to get information that can be used to solve and prevent crimes. And so what they do is to use people for a good, to achieve some sort of good. So Kantians, would disapprove of using people for purposes, even though these purposes are good, and so would I disapprove of this. I'm not trying to justify anything, but at least the explanation makes sense, right? It's something you understand, and it does aim at something you'd recognize as a good. You think, well, what is the objective here? And now at least you can understand that there's an objective that really does qualify as a good. So I think that any adequate discussion of drug policy today should not automatically label it as a failure on the ground that it's done very little to reduce the use of drugs or drug harms. In the eyes of some people, that's not the point. That's not what they care about. And it's not the most important criterion by which we should decide that our drug policy is a success or a failure. Unless you appreciate that point, the continued persistence of drug use the continued persistence of our drug policy will remain something of a mystery. I think it's a mystery to me otherwise. And so, good place to stop. I look forward to your comments about the war on drugs and why we continue to wage it. So, thank you very much.